Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Uncertainty demands increased operational flexibility through cloud-native technology. I'm Adam Blair, the editor of Retail Touchpoints, and I'll be moderating today's session. The current global crisis has transformed business for every retailer. They face tough questions. How can they provide personalized and seamless omnichannel buying experiences on a 24/7 basis without customers in stores? One part of the answer could be cloud-native solutions, which offer both the flexibility customers need and the agility that this fast-changing situation demands, as well as opportunities to improve customer service and even generate cost savings. Our speakers today will be sharing lots of information about this topic, and we encourage you to share some of your own data points and takeaways on Twitter. Social information from me and our speakers is available on this slide. The session is part of the 2020 Connected Consumer Series. During this series, attendees have the opportunity to hear from leading industry experts who are discussing the most important topics on retailers' minds today. By registering for one session, attendees will have access to all complimentary presentations, both live and on demand. For those of you who may be new to Retail Touchpoints, here's a quick overview. We're an all-digital media company publishing 2 weekly online newsletters, daily news, special reports, and multimedia presentations. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe to our weekly newsletters. We welcome input and feedback through traditional means, phone and email, as well as social media, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. Our website address is www.retailtouchpoints.com. For today's presentation, we're using the On24 platform. Right now, you should be seeing the On24 dashboard that shows the live viewing screen. By clicking on the Questions widget on the right-hand side of the screen, you can type in questions during the live presentation and press Submit. You can also find a widget named Resources under Questions. Here you can download assets our presenters have provided. All you have to do is click on the resource, and it will automatically download. Now just a few housekeeping details. The presentation is slated for about 40 minutes, and I encourage you to submit questions as they come to mind. Our speakers will be able to answer those following the webinar event, and we'll make sure that they get to every question. I encourage you also to follow up on social media if you want to discuss some of the session's takeaways in more detail. In addition, the webinar is being recorded, and all the attendees will receive an archive link to the presentation to go back and review or share with colleagues. You'll also have access to the slide deck through SlideShare. Now I'm very pleased to introduce our speakers. Brian Kilcourse is a managing partner at Retail Systems Research, which helps companies develop winning strategies with its industry-leading research focused on the extended retail industry. He's a sought-after public speaker on subjects ranging from emerging technologies to IT governance and best business practices. Before co-founding RSR in 2007, Kilcourse was president and chief executive of Retail Systems Alert Group, a B2B media company focused on the retail ecosystem. Kilcourse was also the SVP and CIO at Long's Drug Stores, a $5 billion enterprise with markets in the U.S., West Coast, and Hawaii from 1993 through 2002, where he led pioneering efforts in areas including BI and analytics, price optimization, e-commerce, workflow automation, and warehouse robotics. Jeff Ball is the Vice President for Strategic Business Development and Store Systems at Manhattan Associates. He's been working with retail technology for over 25 years and helped retailers, both large and small, transform their business to meet the needs of their customers. Before joining Manhattan Associates, Jeff spent 26 years in multiple roles with NCR and Oracle, spanning R&D, professional services, customer support, solutions consulting, sales, and sales management. Kevin Swanwick is Senior Director of Retail Solutions at Manhattan Associates. He has 30 years' experience in the retail technology and store system sector, spanning multiple generations of technology in nearly all aspects of software sales, marketing, design, and delivery. He's been a partner and principal at CRS Retail Systems, serving as EVP Sales and Marketing. In his current position, he serves as a product manager for the OmniStore system space and guides product strategy for the same. Welcome. So today's session is going to be more like a conversational Q&A than a traditional presentation. So I'm going to get started and pose some questions to our distinguished speakers. Brian, I'm going to start with you.
Okay.
The first question I have is a kind of a big overview question. Aside from the introduction and growth of online shopping, How would you say American shopping has changed in the last 10 to 15 years?
That's the $64,000 question, right? Or maybe inflated to $64 million. A lot has changed in the last decade or two. The first thing I want to say is, of course, that people love to shop. That's as old as humanity. But how we shop has changed dramatically. And a lot of our shopping behaviors are really formed by two really big events that happen, particularly in the younger generation of adults. Those two events are, first of all, the Great Recession, and the second one is the introduction of smart mobile technologies in 2007 with the iPhone. When you think about what happened to us back in the beginnings of the Great Recession, and we're seeing echoes of this with the coronavirus epidemic problem, is that people suddenly had to be much, much more selective and careful with their money than they had been before. And this was a dramatic change for a lot of shoppers. The good news for shoppers in 2007 and 8 was they now had this new device that they could then use to inform their shopping behaviors and their purchase decisions. And they grabbed onto that technology and used the power of information to change how they shopped. And they've retained all of those smart shopping habits from developed in harder times, and they're taking them forward even into today. So mobile and price transparency really drive purchase decisions nowadays. The other thing, too, is that people are working a lot harder for a lot less money. There's this organization called the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD, and you might have seen this. They have a better life index. And what's pretty clear, particularly in Western economies, is that people are working harder and enjoying it less. So there's a whole lot less discretionary income to spend. They're spending much, much more of their time in the working environment, and they need to use those smart technologies to make their lives better. That's what they're doing with it. And we're seeing this exemplified in today's market. Certainly, there's this nagging insecurity that never really went away with the Great Recession, and we're seeing huge echoes of it now today as we speak. That consumers just have this feeling of impermanence that they just can't get past, and that makes them much, much more discriminating, much less loyal, much harder to please, and they will go to the solution provider that solves their problem best. And that's the last point I want to make, and that's that people have shifted away from products and now are moving towards solutions. And you're seeing some extreme examples of this. For example, fashion as a service. I was thinking about Stitch Fix, for example, or the used clothing stores that are online. Those kinds of things. People are looking for solutions for their lifestyle need, not necessarily the accumulation of more things. So there's been a lot of really big changes. Many of them are driven by the power of information, and information is now available 24/7 to consumers, and that's an underlying thing that's just probably never going to go away. Shopping is now 24/7, informed by great information. Essentially, the assortment is the world, and retailers have to live in that new reality.
Great, thank you, Brian. Jeff or Kevin, do you want to add anything on that, or should we go on to the next?
Yeah, I mean, I would just add quickly. This is Kevin. To second the points that Brian made. I mean, my observation over, I would say at least, certainly the last 15 years is that this thing we call loyalty has been proven to be utterly ephemeral. So the struggle to maintain that has become more difficult for retailers, for sure, and for brands. And secondly, I think and we'll talk about this more, of course, but the space for making mistakes has really shrunk down. And I mean, for retailers and merchants, particularly in the area of fashion. And I think just, keeping up on the business journals make that pretty clear. And of course, there's implications for technology for both of those things that we need to be looking at hard.
Those are really good points, Kevin. I was thinking as you were speaking that one of the things that we see in our research is that consumers really want to trust a solution provider. They will essentially want to outsource a lifestyle problem to somebody that they can trust. But the trust is built with consistent execution, great information, and availability. These are the things that consumers are looking for all the time. And there are lots of things that erode trust. There are lots of problems with retailer systems that make the reliability of their information somewhat suspect. And all of these things kind of chip away at the retailer's brand value to consumers. And companies like Amazon have frankly taken advantage of that.
Yeah, for sure.
All right. Well, let's move on. I mean, that you laid out kind of as we said, the big themes. And I guess the question is, with so much technology, how does this modern technology help retailers to deliver and impact the omnichannel customer experience, even while that experience and consumers' desires continue to change?
It's such a fundamental question. But to put this into context, think about how we used to shop. When we used to go into a store, that's where demand began. And the way we would do it, if you're like me, you'd walk into a store and you'd look around, see it was on sale. And remember when we used to have the roto in a little pile by the front door? We would look at what's on sale. We'd look at the national brand. We'd look at the private label. We'd walk the aisles. And while that was going on, demand was being generated. And then we would put what we wanted. We'd make our selection, put them in a basket, and walk to the front, check out, and go home. So demand was generated in the store, in the physical four walls of the store, and it was also fulfilled in the physical four walls of the store. And of course, that occupied our full attention in those days. We thought it was so difficult. In retrospect, that seems kind of easy. Nowadays, demand is generated largely in the digital domain. Selections are often made in the digital domain. Sometimes we even pay for it, and then we might go to the store to have it fulfilled, or we might have it shipped direct to our door. And there are many points of demand generation, and there are many points of demand fulfillment. And instead of having a one-to-N kind of a hierarchical design to our business, we now have an end-to-N, a many-to-many model that we have to live with. And what's driving this is digital. Of course, it's digital and the information that it delivers to us. And it's important for us to remember this picture of these young people sitting there playing with their games. It is important to understand that digital is a birthright to a whole lot of people who are either just joining the buying public or already there. This slide here kind of makes me sad. I'm in that green bunch. We're slowly disappearing. But the important thing is that Gen X is in control of most businesses today. Generation Y is coming up real strong, and Generation Z is already on its way. So for a good part of these digital people we're looking at, digital is already a birthright. They accept it just the same way we accept a channel changer on a television or a microwave oven. These are real things to these people, and they're using the power of information to inform their decisions outside of the store. All of this is technology driven, and I can speak as a former CIO. That has changed the role of information. It's moved from the back office which is all about record keeping in the old days, and it's now about actually informing the purchase decision of consumers wherever they are. And that changes the role of information from a tactical one to a strategic one. It's so fundamental, it hardly ever gets said in such simple terms, but it's a really, really big deal.
That's an excellent point. Jeff or Kevin, did you want to add anything?
Well, I'll just pick up on one point that Brian made that I think is really important, and that is communications. I mean, I think this model which Brian describes really is where retailing itself, the industry it's become completely inverted with this many-to-many relationship. But one of the big challenges is, how do you communicate with your customer given this digitally inverted environment? And one example where I see a big lag here is in the area of promotions. And if you think about the history of that, and Brian and I, maybe Jeff, are old enough to remember this, is, merchants, operating in apparel back in the day on the retail method of accounting and all that, and, where they were marking down, taking, hard marks on their inventory. It became the method of creating demand in a lot of cases. I mean, there was the end of season, let me move it out, but there was also, how can I drive more sales? And then this took the form of coupons, and those were mailed out and so forth. And unfortunately, that model has persisted through this inversion. And today, and I see this still, it operates like a blunt instrument. And I know we'll talk about this more when we get into the technology a little bit, but one of the clear demands, and I think what I see a lot of retailers struggling with, is how to contextualize something like promotions, which really become a form of communication with your multivariate customers here, as you can see in the graph. And so context and relevance is everything, right? And when promotions are used, and they still are in many cases, like a blunt instrument, it becomes a race to the bottom. And I think that's something that's no longer really permissible, given how tight margins and competition are today.
That's a great point. In our research, we ask retailers the question all the time, what's the rate of promotions? And the rate of promotions still is on the increase. Retailers are fighting on price and convenience. The problem with fighting on price and convenience is there can only be one winner there, and it's either going to be Walmart or Amazon if you're in the U.S., one of those two. And it's very, very difficult to compete with those because on any given moment they can just lower the price, and they do. Yeah. If that's your value proposition, you're going to fight really hard for minimal gain. What we advise retailers to think about is what are some of the other attributes of this thing called value. Consumers are really, really smart. They're amazingly price sensitive. They're aware of who is offering the lowest price, who is the most convenient shop, and those kinds of things. And you can't play games with price the way you used to. You can't force people to buy what they don't want to buy, regardless of what price it is. And they're doing all this work for you in the digital domain. So the question is, how do you create value for them? We've also seen in our research that the consumers don't necessarily always go to the lowest price. They go to the best value. It's a much more complex equation, and a big component of that, as I said, is information. So, for example, we do this. Every one of us does this. We check reviews before we decide to purchase anything. How interested are you in buying something that has 0 reviews associated with it? Well, that's an aspect of value. That's the point that I'm trying to make, is that value is complex. It's driven by information. It's not just price and convenience anymore. So the problem with promotions is it's a hangover from 20th century retailing, which clouds the entire value equation.
Yeah, precisely.
So let me just add one thing. This is Jeff. You mentioned a couple things. You mentioned value. You mentioned multiple touch points. You mentioned trust. And I think all of those are driven by what we touched on, which is communication. And given those multiple touch points, obviously our ability to communicate, where we communicate, how we communicate, and what we communicate continues to change. And having the flexibility and technology plays a big part in this, obviously, but having that flexibility to communicate across, expanding touch points is going to be key because as you mentioned earlier, you build trust over a long period of time, and poor communication that generates frustration is going to erode that trust quickly. Whereas if you can really provide good information, timely information where and when it's needed, then you can build that trust and you can build that value that you were mentioning.
Well, trust, it takes a long time to build up and it takes seconds to destroy. I was talking to a reporter yesterday in Southern California, and of course we're all dealing with the coronavirus. And she asked me to explain what I meant by that. I said, well, imagine you're Southern Californian, so you shop at Vons. Imagine that you get onto Vons' website and you notice that Charmin toilet paper is on sale. And so you reserve a 24-pack of Charmin, and then you decide to go to the store to pick up your order, only to discover that they were really out of stock. How many more times are you going to shop at Vaughn's? And she said, none, zero. And that's my point. The information was inaccurate. Trust was destroyed. She's not going back to Vaughn's. That's it.
Yeah.
That's a great example of some of the time crunches or time compressions that have taken place. Consumers are behaving in real time, but in a lot of cases, retailers are not. So
Right.
I'm curious as to what some of the additional implications of that are in terms of the retailer's relationship with the consumer and vice versa, and also what you guys were mentioning about the communications. What does that time disjunction do to that relationship?
Well, let's think about retail processes. Let's think about how my generation of retail technicians enable these processes. They're built on cycles that, by today's standards, seem kind of arcane. They're based on monthly or weekly or daily cycles. So we would update, for example, we'd update our inventory or our stock ledger based on the day's receipts and sales, and that would be what we'd had for the next day going forward. Consumers are working in real time, and by real time I mean real time, as in now, anytime and anywhere. And the best example of real time I can think of is looking at the stock market. That's real time. If you decide to buy some stock and you push the buy button, you're not expecting a confirmation at the end of the day and the price that you ended up paying. You expect it to happen right then and there. Consumers have the same expectations of retailer systems, but underneath them, the legacy systems that people like me implemented were never meant for that kind of activity. Now, we've front-ended them with all kinds of modern technology, but they're still in the back end. There are these transaction-driven systems that are based on cycles that consumers have either no awareness of or no respect for. And the inventory issue I just told you about is a perfect example of that. How does a retailer deal with not knowing exactly how much available to sell inventory they have at any given location? How do they deal with that? One of the ways that they do it is they say, if I think I have 10 or less of this item, I'll just say I'm out of stock. Or you can risk making the customer unhappy, like in the case that I just described earlier. The consumer goes to the store only to discover that the inventory isn't really there. And these are actually made much more obvious to the world based on what's going on today with the coronavirus. That people are increasingly shopping online, either have direct delivery or to pick it up in the store, and they're finding out that the reliability of the information isn't quite what it should be. It certainly isn't real time. So these are the examples that I'm talking about when you talk about cycles. For a consumer, now is now. It's not in the next 24 hours or the next 48 hours. It's now. And retailer systems are built on much slower cycles.
And it's tough that that's happening at a time when delivery and other types of supply chain and fulfillment are being stretched because there's so much greater demand on them. So if retailers weren't doing a great job of that during normal times, it's even more exposed during now, which is a more crisis-oriented time.
Well, I don't mean to minimize what's going on today, but it's just making more obvious issues that we've been dealing with for the last dozen years. Our research has shown very clearly that retailers have been systematically plugging away at number one, having accurate perpetual inventory available across the enterprise, and number two, making that real time. There's still, something in the area of 35 or 40% of retailers that can't make those commitments to consumers. So they deal with them in other ways. But it's a hard problem, and one of the reasons it's such a hard problem is because of the business processes that retailers employ and the systems they enable them with were never meant for what it is consumers are now asking for.
So we're definitely seeing that retail and shopping has changed in ways both big and small, and that those changes are going to be continuing. What I'm wondering is cloud the technology, the magic wand that's going to make retail in the future work? You guys, what are you guys' thoughts on that aspect of it?
Well, this is Kevin. I would say I don't think there's any, there's no magic to it. It's not a magic bullet and a magic solution, but properly implemented, and this is a fairly broad statement, but properly implemented, it puts a retailer in a position to be able to at least begin to address a number of these challenges. And those folks who do it really well have a jump on this. And so things like having information about customers in real time, or having information about where inventory is, and then having, algorithmic technology in the cloud that can determine best way to fulfill in order to make the customer happy, to meet them where they are in the time frame that they want, but to do it profitably. This is where it's happening, right? It's not happening in legacy technology, and it's not going to. And there's much more, but those are a couple of the critical areas that it plays. The other one, and just not to completely close out on the topic there of communication that Brian touched on, this is converging, as well in the cloud in terms of real-time, appropriate contextual communication with a customer. I mean, we think about things like the status of an order right now. I have some books on order. I want to hear from those folks about, when that delivery is going to happen, but I don't want them spamming me with text or emails, right? And in Europe, for example, we have GDPR. So here we've got, the Can Spam Act and so forth. So on the one hand, we've got the ability to communicate, and using cloud technology, using texting and these other technologies that reside there to communicate with a customer, immediately and promptly. And there's this reach to want to do that more frequently. And on the other side, we have privacy concerns. Zoom is in the papers today on the front page. They're being investigated for their, they've become very popular during COVID-19, but they're also being investigated for privacy concerns.
Oh, no.
Yeah, so we have GDPR on the one hand saying, hey, you've got to be very careful with how you've got the ability to communicate with people and to work with their data. But on the other hand, you have restrictions, and that's going to be coming here as well. There are other things as well, but these are areas that I think, on the one hand, have huge potential, and some folks are taking advantage of them early and seeing benefits from that. But we're still early, and there's going to be a lot to learn, and there's going to be an evolution here as we move forward.
It's going to sound like a truism, but it's important to remember that the consumer lives in the cloud. They are in the cloud all the time. That's where they are, or the digital representation. Kevin was talking about some of the consumer privacy concerns, but consumers are serving up a lot of data about themselves all the time. In the news this week was this issue of geolocation tracking, and is it a good or a bad thing? And it turns out that the jury is really out. When a panel of experts were asked, I think it was 50-50. Some people said it's great data. We should be using it to communicate directly with consumers in the context of what they're doing in their lives. And the other group, the other 50%, said that's really dangerous. Now, the reason that this came up is because some countries are using geolocation data to understand the spread of the coronavirus and people's, if you will, their patterns, their daily life patterns, and trying to help them to quarantine certain areas while not bothering with others. So that's just a very real today concern. But when you think about retailers and consumers, retailers could contact customers directly in their daily journey through life, and send them value-building messages that are pertinent to whatever problem they're trying to solve. And that might be a good thing, but it has to be done with great deal of sensitivity. The other point I'm trying to make here is that it's all in the cloud. That's all happening in the cloud, not inside the raised floor data center.
So Brian, you mentioned, consumers in the cloud, and I think the key is the term cloud is used pretty broadly. And there's definitely a difference in technology. We've made advancements there. So you had mentioned earlier that, we're trying to take legacy systems and make them seem as real time as possible. And in doing that, a number of times, those systems have been hosted in a cloud environment so that they're more available. But we're still gluing those systems together through integrations and things like that. So there have been advancements in technologies that make what the consumer views as the cloud, their phone, their apps are updated. You can get them, and it doesn't create a big effort on their part to do it. That's their view of the cloud, and that capability is now available for systems as well. So we can take cloud native technology and really, instead of gluing things together, you've got APIs that you can use to really pass that real-time information back and forth, and the applications can be componentized so that we can update them on the fly, like you do on your phone. Your Twitter app, your Facebook app, your whatever apps are updated, and it's not impacting other things. So those things are available, and it really has made a big difference in what we can do now, rather than just tying legacy systems together.
Oh, there's no question about it. What a lot of retailers are doing now is they're putting essentially their customer-facing applications or their employee-facing applications in the cloud, and they move operational data into these data stores or data lakes, as some people call them, in the cloud, and then bring new functionality to the employees and to the customers via their mobile devices or whatever device they happen to be using, and then worrying about the interfaces on the back end using APIs to connect and to update their transaction systems. That's a good transitional strategy, by the way. I mean, even if you looked at all the old systems, all the old ERPs, and said, these aren't appropriate for today's business world, you can't possibly change them all. They're too expensive and take too long. And consumers are justifiably unforgiving of all these, what I've jokingly called idiosyncrasies of legacy systems. So you have that choice, and it's a good choice to take as an interim strategy. Ultimately, I believe what's going to happen is that the systems that we'll use in the future will be very much like what we experience now in a native cloud application. Our job as systems people is to deliver the right piece of data and the right business rules to a person who's making a decision in the context of that decision so that they can move forward. And that person might be a merchandise manager, or it might be an employee filling an order in a store, it might be a customer investigating a product. Our job is to get the information and the business rules to them in a way that's contextually appropriate to the problem they're trying to solve. And that's in the cloud. That's how that'll happen.
Yeah, I could. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to, second this. I mean, in terms of picking and choosing, I mean, that's one of the most important things folks have to do, because there is, limited budget. And what we're seeing, and, we've observed pretty clearly, is that once that move has made in a big way, usually, your web commerce platform is probably an easy place to start, because folks have been doing that for a long time, and you kind of expand from there. And what you find is that you want to eliminate these dependencies on legacy software as quickly as you can, because the conversation changes utterly. When we're trying to explain sometimes to folks, well, what version of software is that? To say, well, what version of Facebook are you on? It's an utterly different model, because when we're talking about cloud native, what we really mean is through and through thoroughbred, if you will, microservices architected properly, each one discrete, each one having an endpoint. and being able to operate and scale out instead of up very quickly. So when suddenly, we used to see the funny commercial on TV when, a company first went online and all of a sudden the orders come in and you would just watch it, and the thing blows up because they hadn't anticipated the volume and there was no means to scale. And in properly architected cloud technology today, that's no longer a problem. Scaling out and back in, or up and down, if you will, can happen very rapidly, but also there need to be the proper components, orchestrated together, and things like, business flags, because in a community, when you have commercial software and you have a bunch of retailers operating on it, what you're really saying is everyone's on the same, version, if you will, all the time. And as Jeff indicated earlier, that has to be a zero uptime environment. So when you provide additional functionality, add enhancements, make changes, those are applied generally to everyone. And so things like having, a business flag is am I even using this? Is this going to be transparent to me? Having a lower life cycle time period scheduled and orchestrated so that I can be communicated to, onboard it, begin to test it, look at it, decide whether I want to use it, and then seamlessly have that new functionality roll into place. I mean, this is utterly, I grew up in the store system space where we had, millions of lines of code distributed to thousands of locations and thousands more devices. And this became an utterly impossible task to upgrade customers. And as vendors, we all talked about, here's our upgrade path and here's how we're going to do it. And I would say, the truth was, to a man, really, it's either impossible or it's very, very costly, and it's going to take a very long time. And those last two items made it really impractical for most businesses. And so you lived in a world where there was all this pressure from operations in a company on IT. Why can't we have this? Why can't we deliver this? Why does it have to cost so much? And I think one of the things that cloud has done is to take some of that pressure off of IT and allow those organizations to reform themselves to be able to work with, the business and deliver things, much quickly and with less disruption and lower cost, at least if it's done properly.
Yeah, what you're bringing up is really, really interesting. We did a study, I think it might have been 2 years ago now, but a year and a half anyway. It was about IT spending, which direction it was going. And we discovered, of course, that the stuff I'm sure you know, Kevin, is that when you look at a total IT budget, an expense side budget, it was roughly a 50-50 split between infrastructural needs and business applications. I think our number was 48% of the spend went toward the infrastructural needs, and the 52% went toward business apps. And of the business apps, 50-something percent, I think it was 54 or 55%, went towards maintenance of the existing portfolio, and only 46% went to new development or the packages. So that's a half of a half. So of all the money that retailers are spending on IT, only 25% of it actually, and this is on a good day, goes toward developing new value. And retailers, one of the things that they're so interested in cloud is they really want to dramatically alter that equation. That they don't have time to do it that way any longer. They have to think differently.
That brings up a great point about what the cost implications are for retailers. And you've all done a great job also of describing some of the ways that cloud native technology makes a business more agile. But Jeff, I wanted to direct this to you about the cost implications. And obviously, Brian and Kevin can chime in if there's things we didn't cover about the agility aspect. But obviously, cost is always an issue for retailers. What are some of the cost implications if they decide to move more into cloud-native technology?
Yeah, so the comment that Ryan made as far as where cost is going is important. So being able to take your cost and focus it more on value, adding value is a big improvement with the cloud native technology. Instead of managing and maintaining that infrastructure and those upgrades and things like that, you're doing upgrades that have zero downtime and no cost to do it. And so now you can redirect that cost. It's a cost savings in one area, but now let's leverage that and build new innovation, new value to the system instead of just maintaining it. So that's a great opportunity that's there. Another one with the technologies that are out there, there's open source software that's now available and can be leveraged, which again, instead of spending on heavy databases and things like that, how can we leverage some open source software and really drive that total cost of ownership down? And then finally, I'd just say that the APIs that are available, we're as Brian mentioned, this is not a single heavy lift and you're over to it. There's so many legacy systems out there that we're going to have to transition over time. And those APIs and access points that are available allow you to make that transition. You can ease the integration and kind of set your roadmap to get there based on your business, but it definitely will make it more feasible.
It's an interesting thing that you say, Jeff. I'm thinking in my past as a CIO, there's certain things that those who are considering cloud solutions need to consider. One of them is that this below the line versus above the line equation. It's important to remember that capitalization was a tool that CFOs use to amortize the cost of systems across the enterprise over a period of time. And there's no good or bad to it. It's just what we did. And you have to, if you're selling to these folks, you have to make sure that they understand the implications of so much of the money going to the expense side, not to the amortization line. And with that in mind, you have to be very sensitive to the fact that, as I think Kevin, you said, cloud-based applications can scale out and up. There are going to be variable costs associated with that need to be identified and controlled. One of the things that retailers really dislike is lack of control when it comes to spend, when it comes to money. So that has to be thought through very clearly. But there are a lot of things that, aside from just the cost of maintaining the applications, that come out into the forefront. One of the things that comes out is that if you are accepting cloud-based applications as opposed to doing it the traditional way of bringing a licensed app in-house and making some modifications, you're altering how you spend money in a fairly dramatic way. There's so much good news about today's modern cloud-based apps. One of them is that they work, and I don't mean to denigrate any of the solutions that I chose in the 80s and the 90s. But in fact, those were more frameworks, and we would spend a tremendous amount of money, usually some multiplier of the license cost of the application, modifying it beyond all recognition so it would do what we wanted it to do. And of course, we took the ownership of all those modifications. Today's cloud-based apps are so flexible and so agile that you can essentially populate your business process with the business rules and the data, as I mentioned, to suit your particular business needs. So that brings up an interesting question, and that is, are you doing the right process? So the spend is going to go more towards this process development and organizational development around the business process than it is on the technology. I happen to think that's a really good thing, but you need to be aware that the spend shifts. It goes to a different place, and that's something that the retailers need to be aware of. I think it's all good news. It's signaling the change that the technology enables us to do.
Yeah, Brian, you mentioned one thing there in terms of paying attention to scale and costs of that, because retail, as we know, is not only cyclical, but it has its very sudden peaks and valleys, and those can't always be predicted. And I think, as in the vendor community here, one of the things that became clear and is incumbent on us is that whatever your subscription model is for usage of a product, it needs to include and have built into its model scale. So in other words, if I'm a retailer, as you mentioned, because they don't want surprises, rightfully so. They need to be able to budget their year, and they shift away from the capital model to the expense model in large measure. But with that, it can't be so variable that I can't actually budget for it. So I think it's incumbent upon us as vendors to have that built in to our cost model, where the scaling out is included, and I'm not going to see utilization cause my cost to go up within a contract period, right? It's going to follow whatever the standard pricing model is, and I'm not going to get surprised.
I think you're right. I mean, it changes the notion of a service contract, doesn't it? When you think about the way we signed contracts in the past, the cost of the technology was indexed to something like, for example, the number of CPUs or number of named users or this or that or the other thing. And CIOs were very adept at arguing the case in their own favor. But now you have a world in which services are being delivered in real time to a variable number of users with variable performance metrics associated with them. So the nature of a service contract is fairly dramatically different. And when you're trying to negotiate with a retailer as a solutions provider, you have to be aware that they may not be as up on this stuff as you are. There's a good deal of pre-sales training that has to be undertaken, but I think it's just it's a turn of the crank, right? This is the new technology. This is how we deliver applications today. This is how we enable businesses to move forward. It's just the latest iteration of bringing technology to the people that need it.
Yeah,
that's a great segue to what's going to be the final question and round of commentary, which is about what are the practical steps that retailers can do to take advantage of these possibilities to get started. What kinds of things are the first things they need to look at, and what's a logical path forward?
So I'll give a couple of recommendations. There's a couple of things that retailers can do. And the very first thing they need to do is they need to look at their business processes and say, what are the ones that are most critical to us that are not performing up to specification or up to the need? And that is really important. The other thing, of course, is you have to have a data plan. I'm trying to not use the word an enterprise data model because that's kind of old tech, but you have to understand your strategic asset, what data you have, where are the holes, what are the cycles of that data, those kinds of things. Having done that legwork, one of the things that we oftentimes see retailers doing is picking something that's important but fairly discrete that can be separated from your legacy technology stack and performed in the cloud. And a perfect example of this is forecasting. Forecasting has changed dramatically in the last several years because of the availability of new data and the availability of AI engines to consume that data. And so the idea of developing alternative forecasts based on different models has become very, very popular. Forecasting is something that can be separated from your mainstream legacy processes and put up in the cloud. And it's just one example, but it's one that we see retailers taking advantage of. There's just so I would say start with a plan. Understand where your critical processes are, which ones are underperforming and need to change to meet the demands of the times. Understand your information asset. Understand where it is, what its periodicity is. Is it where are the holes? Where are the places where it leaks? And then develop a go-forward plan based on what some people call as a cloud center of excellence to start thinking about moving some of the discrete the separatable processes up into the cloud so that you can start experiencing that world. That's how I'd start.
Yeah.
Jeff or Kevin, do you have any other best practices or key steps that are important for retailers just getting started or starting to move along?
Yeah, I think there's a number of examples that back up exactly what Brian's saying. I mean, those, if you think about it, sometimes these things are just, sort of operational. Like we know our customers want to be able to buy online and pick up in the store. And I think, honestly, I think everybody knew that there was going to be some gold in those hills. But I think everyone, including us, by the way, who are, order management mavens, if you will, underestimated, the impact of something like that. And so there were, as Brian said, there's some certain fundamental pieces that have to do with data, that have to do with process, and a number of other things that go along with that. But at the investment in something like that, call it low-hanging fruit to use a cliche, will return, huge, value. And from there, you can build out and say, okay, well, where else do we have known, weaknesses where we're not able to execute that go directly to what we talked about at the beginning of this call was how am I going to keep customers, loyalty? How am I going to meet their expectations and all of that? I mean, if you go down that list within your organization, I mean, they should be, bold at the top and red sitting right in front of you, right? And those are easy enough to identify, I think, but it takes a lot of planning and work. But once executed, there's huge value to be gained there, and then you can build out from there.
Yeah, and the last thing I would. Oh,
go ahead, Jeff.
Go ahead there, Brian. Okay, I was just going to say the last thing to include that I'd include is you talked about having a plan with your data. You talked about understanding your processes. I would just add that as you go through that, have a plan on how you plan to engage your customer in all those touch points, so that you're not surprised at the end saying, oh, but I don't have the data I need to share with the customer in all the places that I'm going to communicate with them.
That's. I was going Brian, I'll give you the last word on this. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say there was something that we just brought up just a second ago about buy online, pick up in store. That's another very, very good application. It's very hot on retailers' to-do list right now. One of the things that retailers need to do is address the elephant in the room and make sure their networks are up to the task. that was what I was going to say about that. Mm-hmm. But the other thing you just mentioned was understand what the customer really wants. One of the things that we find continuously, and it's always surprising to us when we talk to retailers, is have you designed your desired path to purchase? Not all paths to purchase are equal. They're different. Sometimes there are different paths depending on what you're buying. But one of the questions we ask is, have you designed what you, the retailer, want to provide to the customer? You'd be surprised how often they say no. And you need to do better than that. You need to design what you want the customer to experience when they connect with your brand, and then go from there.
That's great. Well, listen, guys, unfortunately, we've run out of time, and if members of the audience did put in questions during the session, as I hope they did, we'll forward those to the panelists, and they'll be able to respond to you. But right now, I want to thank all of the panelists, Jeff and Kevin and Brian, really fantastic insights and some strong practical examples. So we hope you're going to join us for our next Connected Consumer Series presentation, which is titled Retail's Shrinking Margin for Error. The top brands are using next-level intelligence to find new customers and improve bottom-line performance. That session is going to start at 12 noon Eastern Time tomorrow, April 7th. And until then, please have a great day and stay safe.